Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with Part 4, Political Brotherhoods, Socialism, of The Brotherhood of Man by J.E. Richardson TK. Chapter 4, Political Brotherhoods. 1. Socialism. There are other brotherhoods in addition to those already mentioned, which it might be well to analyze, elucidate, and define. Some of those are certain forms of brotherhood which are generally and very aptly termed political, for the purpose of gathering as much extant information as may be possible concerning the various and different lines along which humanity has sought to develop the principle of brotherhood. It is necessary to consider one or more of the political brotherhoods with more care and much greater detail than has heretofore been done. We recognize the difficulties in this undertaking due chiefly to the utter lack of information in the definitions given to the world by those who are responsible for their formulation and who should have defined each word with the utmost exactness and care. Even the men who have been looked upon by the world in general as accredited authorities disagree as widely as any others when they come to defining the terms employed. First in the list of these political brotherhoods, let us consider the Brotherhood of Socialism. Herein we find that the lack of uniformity in both the ideal expressed and the definitions of terms in which those ideals are clothed afford very little basis on which to proceed without stimulating protest and objections from many directions among those who have made a sufficient study of the subject to regard themselves as duly qualified to speak with authority. Indeed, it is not anticipated that we shall be able to run the gauntlet of criticism unscathed. That the reader may have some suggestion as the difficulties surrounding the subject. However, honestly and earnestly we may endeavor to avoid confusion or criticism. I quote a statement which was made to me by a close personal friend. The specific reason why I finally withdrew from socialism and the entire socialistic movement was that I could find no two acknowledged socialistic authorities who were in entire accord in any of the supposed fundamentals of socialism. In truth, the one man I finally came to regard as my only definite authority over all others disagreed with all of them in virtually every important tenet of socialism. And finally, I often found him disagreeing with himself quite as radically as with any of his lesser authorities. That I may not justly be charged with prejudice, ignorance, nor with the foundation of my own definition of socialism, only to palm it off upon my readers as that of an authority. The following definition of socialism is given from Webster's New International Dictionary. Socialism, a political and economic theory of social reorganization, the essential feature of which is governmental control of economic activities, to the end that competition shall give way to cooperation, and that the opportunities of life and the rewards of labor shall be equitably apportioned. Often, however, socialism is used to denote specifically the economic theories developed by Ferdinand Lassalle and Karl Marx, advocating the annulment of private ownership of capital and land, and maintaining that all values are the creation and just due of labor. To explain more simply and clearly the meanings their authors attach to these, their own definitions of the terms employed to express their understanding of what the term socialism means, let us assume that the members of that party were sufficiently numerous within our democracy to elect a majority of the congressional representatives, United States senators, and the president. They then would have complete control over the law-making power as well as the law-enforcing power of the government. They then could pass any law necessary to carry out their system of reorganization of our government from its present form into a socialistic form of government, such as the foregoing definitions contemplate. They could then proceed to enact laws, nullifying all private ownership of capital and land, which means the process of taking all capital and land away from you and me and every other citizen within the government and giving it over to the government itself. To understand even a small fraction of what this would mean to us as individuals, it is necessary to know exactly what is meant by capital and land. There again, I shall not run the risk of defining the terms myself, well knowing that my own definition would not meet the approval of a very large percent of those who call themselves socialist. On the other hand, I shall use the definitions already formulated by the same distinguished authority, none other than the same self-dictionary from which I have quoted the definition of socialism. By this method, I shall hope to make it rather difficult for my critics to charge me with the crime of ignorance, because of inexcusable want of knowledge as to the fundamental tenets of socialism. I would have them know in advance whom these shafts of their criticism are leveled before they release them. Capital, economics, a stock of accumulated wealth. Specifically, A. The amount of property owned by an individual or corporation at a specific time, as distinct from the income received during a given period. B. The amount of such property which is used for business purposes. C. An aggregation of economic goods used to promote the production of other goods instead of being valuable solely for the purposes of immediate enjoyment. D. The total amount of such goods in continuous existence. Since A is the one in which the word is ordinarily used by accountants, for example in contrasting a capital account with an income account. Since B corresponds to the usage of Adam Smith, who specifically defines capital as that part of a man's stock which he expects to afford him revenue. Since C is the meaning employed by the majority of latter economists, since D is the meaning preferred by J.B. Clark when he contrasts pure or permanent capital with the perishing capital goods composing it. Capital is divided into fixed capital, which is invested for recurrent use in a particular manner, and circulating capital, which is consumed in production but is constantly recovered. In the very first expression under economics, the term is defined generally as a stock of accumulated wealth. To understand the exact sense in which the term wealth is employed, it is defined: A. In the private sense, all property which has a money value. B. In the public sense, all objects, especially material objects, which have economic utility. C. Specifically, called personal wealth, those energies, faculties, and habits directly contributing to make people industrially efficient. Under these definitions, it must be clear that capital, as the word is used by modern socialists, has reference to virtually everything an individual possesses, except, perhaps, the clothes he happens to wear at the time. Land, all those elements in the wealth of a nation which are supposed to be furnished by nature, as distinct from those improvements which owe their value to the labor and organizing power of land. There are utilities, then those credible by man, over the supply of which man has no control. They are given as fixed quantities by nature and therefore have no supply price. The term land has been extended by economists so as to include the permanent sources of those utilities, whether they are found in land, as the term is commonly used, or in seas and rivers, in sunshine and rain, in winds and waterfalls. Alfred Marshall. These definitions have been given in this connection so that the reader may not find it necessary to read through the large number of textbooks on socialism to hunt out their meaning, with these as the basis upon which to establish an understanding of socialism and determine what changes would be necessary to recognize this government of ours into a socialistic institution. The following conclusions would seem both logical and inevitable. 1. Under such a government, a man may own a house, a barn, a pig pen, a chicken coop, a rabbit hutch, but not the land on which these sit. 2. He may own such money only as he earns by his personal labor. If a carpenter, he may build houses, barns, etc. for his neighbors, and own the money he receives for the bare labor he puts into them, but not from any profits he might otherwise derive from furnishing the lumber and other materials necessary for their construction. In other words, if he furnishes the material for the buildings he erects, he must do so at actual cost. 3. He may invest a sufficient amount of money in groceries to set him up in the grocery business, but once he has done this, the groceries become his capital, for the sale of which he may obtain enough money to replenish his stock from time to time with just enough profits to meet his actual living expenses. If he ever desires to discontinue the grocery business, it is not quite clear just how he will proceed without forfeiting to the government such groceries as he had at the time he closed out his business, because his stock is his capital, and the fundamental tenet of socialism is the annulment of capital and giving it over to the control of the government along with the land. 4. If he were a physician, he could keep enough of his earnings to cover the actual cost of his living and that of his family, as well as all others who may be dependent upon him, but he could not charge $500 or $1,000 for a surgical operation and put the money in the bank, because it then becomes capital and belongs to the government. 5. If he were a plumber, he might charge for his labor alone, but if he furnished the materials necessary to complete a given job, he could charge only the cost of the various articles of merchandise necessary to that end. But what if his business did not afford him sufficient compensation in actual labor to cover the cost of living for himself and his family and all those dependent upon him? What will he do? How can he meet the deficit? It does not seem that this practical brand of socialism, carried out to its legitimate and logical conclusion, could possibly provide for this particular contingency, nor does it seem that it can meet many other equally logical conclusions that must arise under such a system, carried out to its ultimate and logical conclusion. Furthermore, it is stated, without equivocation or mental reservation, that the authorities quoted that the ultimate aim and legitimate end of socialism is that, through the annulment of private ownership, personal property, and government control of all economic activities, we shall bring about the utopia condition where competition shall give way to cooperation, and the opportunities of life and the rewards of labor shall be equitably apportioned. In other words, here is a purely theoretical brotherhood that bases its right to intelligent consideration upon its promise to accomplish that which neither God nor nature has ever yet succeeded in bringing to pass. By this is meant the elimination of competition or the establishment of universal cooperation. In truth, wherever we turn our attention, in a critical and intelligent observation and estimation of the methods by which God or nature carries forward the activities and procedures of the planet Earth on which we live, or even those of the greater universe, so far as we can follow them, from the lowest round of the mineral kingdom through all the rounds of the vegetable kingdom, upwards and onwards, even to the highest round of the animal kingdom, and to man himself, we find that competition seems to be quite as universal as cooperation. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.